You won't believe what happened when Karen decided to call the cops on my garage. Except there's a huge twist. I'm actually the police chief, and I own that property. Sounds like something out of a movie, right? Well, this crazy real life encounter with an entitled neighbor quickly spiraled into a showdown none of us expected. It all started on a quiet afternoon when I was just minding my own business, working in my garage, when suddenly Karen storms over, clearly upset. Without even asking questions, she pulls out her phone and threatens to call the police because, in her mind, I'm doing something wrong on my own property. Now, here's where things get interesting. Being the police chief isn't just a title. For me, I know the law inside and out, and I know my rights. Plus, I'm the legal owner of that garage and the surrounding land. So when Karen's complaints started piling up, it didn't take long before the tension escalated. This wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding anymore. It was about entitlement, assumptions, and a major clash of personalities. Throughout this story, you'll see how entitlement can blind people to facts, how assumptions lead to unnecessary conflict, and what happens when power dynamics get flipped in unexpected ways. Karen thought she had the upper hand, calling in what she believed would be backup to support her side, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I want you to stick around because this story doesn't end here. The confrontation raises questions about respect, boundaries, and the surprises that come with knowing the law better than your neighbor. So, what really happened when Karen called the cops? Did she get what she bargained for? How did I handle this tense situation without things getting out of control? Stay tuned, because the next part will reveal all the details. Then trust me, you don't want to miss how this intense story unfolds. To understand how things got so heated with Karen, you need to know a little about the neighborhood and how long I've lived here. I've owned my property for years, and over time, I've put a lot of work into my garage and the surrounding area. It's not just a place to park cars or store tools. It's part of my home and my personal space. Most neighbors respect that. But Karen, she's different. From the moment she moved in, she seemed to think rules didn't apply to her or that she had some special authority over everyone else's property. Karen's always been the type to complain about small things. She's called city officials over minor landscaping issues and has even argued with other neighbors about parking. But this time, her focus was on my garage. Apparently, she thought it was too big or not up to code, even though all my paperwork is in order and everything meets the local regulations. What's crazy is she never asked me any questions or tried to talk it out. Instead, she jumped straight to calling the cops, assuming that would solve the problem. That moment, when I heard her on the phone saying she needed officers to come check on my property, is what really set off alarm bells for me. Not because I was worried about the cops coming I'm the chief. After all, but because it showed just how quick people can be to make judgments without knowing the full story. It also made me wonder, what else is Karen willing to do when she feels entitled? There's more to this than just a garage dispute. It's about trust, respect, and understanding boundaries, things that seem to be missing when entitled people get involved. And as the situation escalated, I realized this could turn into a much bigger problem than I expected. But how far would Karen go? And what would happen when the police actually arrived? The tension was thick, and the next moments would change everything as the minutes ticked by after Karen's call. I couldn't help but think about how entitlement like hers can really mess with a neighborhood's peace. It wasn't just about the garage anymore. It was about how she seemed to believe she could control what I do on my own property. I started to wonder if this was just the beginning of a bigger battle, one that could affect more than just me. After all, when someone feels entitled enough to call the police on their neighbor without any real reason, what does that say about the community we live in? Meanwhile, some of my other neighbors were starting to notice the tension. A few stopped by to ask if everything was okay, and I could tell they were uneasy about what was brewing. They'd seen Karen act this way before, always quick to complain, quick to escalate. It made me think about the unspoken rules we all live by in a neighborhood. Respect each other's space. Communicate before jumping to conclusions, and don't make threats unless there's a real problem. Karen was breaking all those rules, and it felt like things could spiral out of control fast. At the same time, I was dealing with my own internal conflict. On one hand, I knew my rights and had the authority to handle situations like this calmly and professionally. On the other, this was personal. This was my home, my property, and my peace of mind being challenged. Balancing those sides wasn't easy, especially with Karen making a scene and refusing to listen. It made me question how often misunderstandings like this happen simply because people don't take the time to understand each other. There was also an unexpected subplot unfolding. My team at the station had heard about the call and started asking questions. Some were surprised, some amused, and others concerned about how this neighbor drama might affect my role as chief. Suddenly, it wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was something that could have ripple effects professionally. The tension wasn't just outside my door, it was creeping into other parts of my life, making everything feel even more complicated. And just when I thought things couldn't get more intense, the sound of sirens in the distance made it clear this story was far from over. The sound of the sirens grew louder, cutting through the afternoon calm like a warning. I could feel my heart start to race, not because I was worried about the police showing up, but because I knew this moment would change everything. Karen's decision to call the cops wasn't just some petty complaint anymore. It was turning into a full-blown confrontation. As the flashing lights pulled into view, I glanced over at Karen, who looked both smug and nervous at the same time. Convinced she had the upper hand. Neighbors were now gathering along the street, whispering and watching as the officers stepped out of their cars. I noticed the mixed looks on their face, some curious, some skeptical. Word had clearly spread fast, and everyone wanted to see how this showdown would play out. The tension in the air was thick. I could sense that things were about to get messy. Inside, I was preparing myself mentally. I knew my rights, I knew the law, and I knew this was my property. But that didn't mean the situation would be easy to handle. Karen had brought the police here with her version of the story, and even if it was wrong, first impressions mattered. I had to stay calm, clear, and authoritative no matter how much her entitled attitude pushed my buttons. Sand. Part of me worried about what the officers would think once they saw the whole picture. Would they side with me as the chief and property owner, or would Karen's drama cloud their judgment? The uncertainty made the moment feel even more fragile. What if this neighbor's stubbornness escalated beyond a simple property dispute? What if it caused damage to relationships I'd built over years? As the lead officer approached, I noticed Karen whispering something to one of the deputies, her eyes darting toward me like she was ready for a fight. The crowd held their breath, and all I could do was stand my ground and wait. The next few minutes would decide everything, whether respect and truth would win out, or if entitlement and assumptions would take over. The stakes had never been higher, and the tension was almost unbearable. Just when I thought the situation couldn't get any more tense, the lead officer glanced at me with a look that caught me off guard. Instead of the immediate respect I expected, there was hesitation, like he'd just learned something new. Before I could ask what was going on, Karen suddenly pulled out a document and waved it toward the officers. It was some sort of official-looking complaint she had apparently filed weeks ago, claiming that my garage violated neighborhood codes. I hadn't seen this before, and that's when I realized she'd been planning this for a while, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The plot thickened even more when one of the deputies mentioned there was a pending investigation related to a recent complaint about unauthorized modifications on my property. That wasn't just about the garage, it hinted at something bigger, something I hadn't expected to come back around. Karen's quiet buildup of paperwork and complaints suddenly painted her as more than just an entitled neighbor. She was someone who knew how to play the system, and she was using it against me. The crowd watching grew even more restless as whispers spread about the paperwork and the pending investigation. I felt the weight of every eye on me, every assumption being made. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. It was a test of my reputation, my authority, and the truth behind the scenes. Karen's move was clever, but it put me on the defensive in a way I hadn't anticipated, with the officers now reviewing the complaint and talking quietly among themselves. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Would they see through Karen's plan, or would her preparation tip the scales? And what about my team back at the station? How would they react if this escalated beyond the property line? The tension was electric, and the next moments would deck. As the officers carefully reviewed Karen's complaint, I stayed calm but alert, knowing that the truth had to come out and fast. I handed over the official permits and inspection approvals I'd secured for my garage years ago, all perfectly legal and up to code. The lead officer flipped through the papers, his expression shifting from skepticism to understanding. I could see the pieces starting to fall into place, the difference between an entitled neighbor's assumptions and the facts backed by the law. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the unexpected happened. One of the deputies pulled me aside quietly and whispered that someone from the city's planning department had just called, confirming there were no violations or open investigations against my property. Apparently, Karen's so-called pending complaint was actually dismissed weeks ago, but she never told anyone. That meant all her efforts to build a case were based on outdated or false information. The officers returned to the group, and the lead officer addressed Karen directly. He explained that, based on the documentation and the city's confirmation, there was no legal reason to take action against my garage. Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down, insisting she was just trying to protect the neighborhood. It was clear she wasn't ready to back down. But the officers stood firm, with the official side settled. I turned to Karen and calmly reminded her that respect and communication go a long way, especially in a community. I made it clear that baseless accusations and entitlement wouldn't be tolerated. The neighbors watching seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, knowing the truth had prevailed. Just when I thought the story was over, my phone buzzed with a message from my team at the station. They'd uncovered something surprising. Karen had a history of similar complaints against other neighbors, all dismissed after investigation. This wasn't just about a garage or a single dispute, it was a pattern. The real question now was how far Karen would go next and whether the neighborhood was ready for what might come. The conflict wasn't completely over, but at least for now, justice had a clear win. After everything settled down, I took a moment to reflect on what had just happened. This wasn't just a story about a garage or a neighbor calling the cops. It was about how misunderstandings and entitlement can escalate into something much bigger if people don't take the time to communicate. Karen's actions showed me how important it is to stand your ground calmly and know your rights, especially when dealing with someone who's quick to jump to conclusions or push their own agenda. The neighbors started coming by again, offering support and sharing stories about their own run-ins with Karen. It became clear that her behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a pattern that affected the whole community. But instead of letting that create division, it sparked conversations about respect, boundaries, and the importance of talking things out before things get out of hand. I've realized that even in a role like mine, being police chief doesn't mean you can control every situation. But it does mean you can lead by example and encourage fairness. I also learned that sometimes the best way to deal with entitled people is not through confrontation, but by staying composed and letting the facts speak for themselves. When Karen tried to turn neighbors and law enforcement against me, it backfired because I had the truth and the legal right on my side. That's a powerful reminder for anyone facing similar situations. Document your property rights, understand local laws, and don't be afraid to stand firm with respect. In the end, the garage remained just as it always was legally mine and perfectly fine. Karen's calls and complaints didn't change that. What did change was the neighborhood's sense of community. Now stronger because people realized how important it is to listen, communicate, and respect each other. So if you ever find yourself facing an entitled neighbor or unfair accusations, remember the story: knowledge, patience, and calm confidence can make all the difference. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.